want to spend a little bit of time talking about how do you figure out what is figurative. Sometimes you come across a passage and some people will take it literally and other people will take it more figuratively. Well, how do you go about doing that? We'll take a look at Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 and 7 is the passage that we'll look at. A passage that certain people in certain traditions have tended to take more literally, speaking of a future messianic time. But Isaiah 11, verses 6 and 7, I'll go ahead and read that. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and the little boy will lead them. Also the cow and the bear will graze, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The question is that to be taken literally as something about the conditions in the Messianic kingdom where carnivorous animals will somehow exist peacefully with plant-eating animals? Or is it intended to be more of a figurative sort of a passage describing something else? We'll go back to the 4 C's of interpretation, the keys to interpretation of content, context, comparison, consultation. And we'll do the same thing that we did earlier with Psalm 133. We'll work through each of those 4 keys one after the other. So we'll take a little bit of a look at the content of the passage itself. What would be some observations that we might make about the actual data of the passage? Well, if you were to think in your mind of a chart, and in one column you would write down domesticated animals, and on the other side of the chart you would write down carnivorous animals, we might just plot in the animals that are mentioned in this passage. So you have a wolf, which is what? A carnivore. You have a lamb, which is a domesticated animal. You have the leopard, which is a carnivore. You have the kid, a baby goat, on the domesticated side. You have the calf on the domesticated side, young lion on the carnivorous side. You have the fatling on the domesticated side along with the cow, and then you have the bear on the other side with the predator. And it says their young will lie down together. You've got the lion eating straw, so we'll put that over on the carnivore side. You've got the ox, again, on the domesticated side. So we have 2 types of animals. That would be one of the main observations that we see in this passage. So you've got carnivorous animals acting like domesticated grass-eating animals, and they're getting along together. That's probably the big observation that you would make out of those verses. So that's the first key to interpretation, content. Now, if we were to go to the second key, which is context, we would have to divide the passage somehow and say, these 2 verses, what is the bigger context that they're a part of? And I would break this at chapter 11, verses 1 through 10. And one of the reasons I would break it here is because you have one of those bookending or framing devices called an inclusio. You have it in verse 1, you have it in verse 10. So we have a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. That's verse 1. Verse 10, then it will come about in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. So bookending this passage is something about the descendant who is coming from Jesse or from David's line. Okay, so if we were to look at that context, we'd consider all of those verses there. And then if we wanted to even spread our context a little bit wider, we would take Isaiah 7:1 through Isaiah 12:6, and that's pretty much one unit that is talking about a historical crisis at the time of Isaiah, which had to do with the nation of Assyria. The Assyrians were threatening the nation of Judah, and this material is part that Isaiah delivered to the king at the time, King Ahaz, in order to encourage him to have faith in God, which he didn't do. But if we were going to expand our understanding to verses 6 and 7 to verses 1 through 10, we would want to observe what's going on in the overall passage. So I'll do some reading from verse 2. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, this descendant who's coming from Jesse, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Also righteousness will be the belt about his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. So in these verses, it's talking about this person who is coming from the line of David, who's going to be king, and it describes what kind of a king he's going to be. He's going to be righteous, he's going to keep the law, he's going to be godly, he's going to make decisions that are fair and just. And then it appears that the verses that follow are going to be consequences of that reign. So you have the wolf dwelling with the lamb, the leopard with the kid, the calf and the young lion, the fatling together, the little boy leading. The cow and the bear will graze, their young will lie down together, the lion will eat straw like the ox, and the nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. We saw that in Habakkuk, actually. So it seems to be the first set of verses are talking about the nature of the one who is coming to reign. And then the last set of verses is talking about the results, the consequences, the benefits of how that person reigns. Now, if we wanted to then expand to the next key to interpretation, we would do comparison. And something interesting that we find is when we do comparison with the other prophets, we discover that several of Israel's prophets actually depict Israel's ideal future through shepherd and sheep imagery. So you look at a passage like Jeremiah 50, verses 17 through 19, Jeremiah 23, 3 through 6, Ezekiel 34, 11 through 16, Micah 5, 2, Zephaniah 3, 13b. All passages, so 4 different prophets in 5 passages who are saying basically the same thing, that in the future Israel is going to dwell like God's flock, normally surrounded by these predatory nations like the Assyrians, like the Babylonians, but in the future, because of the anointed king's reign, they're going to be at peace with these nations that are normally like predators of God's flock. And then we have to decide, is that literal? Is that figurative? To me, it seems like that's probably going to be more of a figure of speech. That in the future, Israel is going to have an unparalleled time of peace because they're going to have this unparalleled kind of a leader who's wise and who's godly and who leads people to obey God's law. And then they have all of the benefits from that. Now, in this case, we could go on and do consultation, but we probably don't really need to because I think we've pretty well learned about as much as we've needed to do. So again, just by running through the content of the passage, looking at the context surrounding that context, and then doing comparison, we've come quite a ways to understanding and interpreting a passage that might be a little bit difficult on the surface of things.